And Michael Shank is the Associate Director for Legislative Affairs at the Friends Committee on National Legislation and a faculty member at George Mason University School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. He recently co-authored the New York Times op-ed, Get the Military Off of Main Street, in which he observes that Ferguson, Missouri became a virtual war zone. In the wake of the shooting of the unarmed black youth Michael Brown, the nation witnessed the spectacle of outside armored vehicles lining the streets and tear gas filling the air. Officers dressed in camouflage uniforms from Ferguson's 53-person police force have pointed M16s at the very citizens they were sworn to protect and serve. A significant dimension of the shooting of Michael Brown is the militarization of the police that has national implications. And Michael, good morning.
Good morning, Mimi. It's good to be with you.
Did you hear any of the last segment we did with Jeff Halper from Israel?
I did, from F-35 on to the general pacification. So, yeah, I was looped in on that.
So, well, we're talking about MRAPs and M16s and Humvees, etc. He's talking about a far more sophisticated and frightening form of militarization, something just to put on the front burner and to be aware of. But if you can talk now about the militarization and maybe going from the militarization of our foreign policy that led to the ramping up of the militarization of our policing apparatus at home.
Sure. Well, I'll start with the foreign policy and the militarized foreign policy using the African continent as an example. Last year alone, we had almost 600 military exercises or activities on the continent, and that's a ramp up of 200+% since 2008. So if folks are watching how we deal with Somalia, Libya, certainly Iraq is a great example of this, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, you name the country with the threat, and our response is military first, pretty consistently, and we've seen that in the last 12 years. Well, that trickle-down now is happening in domestic policy, where it looks like for law enforcement, their first response is increasingly military, and that's thanks to two programs. One is through the DoD, the Defense Department. It's called the 1033 program, named after a part of the National Defense Authorization Act in 1997. That gives free equipment from the war zone to our law enforcement. And that's everything, as you mentioned, from tanks, Humvees, mine-resistant ambush protection vehicles, MRAPs, assault weapons, armored drones, helicopters, grenade launchers, etc. Pentagon has given about $4 billion free to police, and I say free, the police have to pay for the delivery and the taxpayer has to pay for that bill, and then the taxpayer has to pay for all maintenance afterwards. So a small town in Virginia called Harrisonburg, where my brother and sister live, they just acquired an MRAP, and now they're asking the citizens to pay another $30,000 just to do short-term maintenance on it. Of course, there'll be long-term maintenance fees as well. But in case the police didn't get an MRAP from the 1033 program, and there was a story out in National Journal this week that Ferguson's military equipment actually didn't primarily come from 1033, they'll get it through the DHS program, Department of Homeland Security's terrorism grants program, and they've given out $34 billion worth of cash grants, essentially, to police since 2001, and then those police can buy the tanks, Humvees, MRAPs, new from the defense industry. And so any small-town police force could have acquired a tank from DHS or DoD. Either way, we're seeing a pretty significant ramp-up of military equipment on our main streets.
Yeah, and I want to just continue on that vein. In one of the pieces that you wrote, I remember reading about the weaponry that was used in Columbia, South Carolina, obtained, and it's if you could talk about that, just to continue to alert us and give us a sense of what is going on our main streets.
Right, so a couple of examples. I'll take another example from South Carolina. Richland County, a sheriff there got a tank with a 360-degree rotating machine gun turret, which he then later named the Peacemaker. And
the peacemaker.
Yeah,
I love it.
Or small towns like Roanoke Rapids in North Carolina getting an MRAP, or a small town in upstate New York getting an MRAP. We're seeing it even in my mom's town, Lancaster, PA, Amish Mennonite country. I grew up Mennonite, and now Amish Mennonite country has an MRAP, and looks like they're getting an MRAP in Lancaster, PA. But there are a whole bunch of other egregious examples on the assault weapons front, and particularly with waste, fraud, and abuse. We're seeing small-town county sheriffs and police chiefs taking the assault weapons, selling them on eBay, giving them to friends. In some of the investigations...
Giving them to friends. I love this.
Yeah, so a sheriff in Illinois was accused of lending assault weapons, which he got through the 1033 program, giving them to friends. A firearms manager in North Carolina pled guilty to selling his on eBay. And 11 districts in Indiana were completely suspended from the 1033 program because of the high volume of weapons they lost. Another county in Arizona acquired $7 million worth of weapons and Humvees before giving them to unauthorized persons and selling them to boost their budget. So just the waste, fraud, and abuse alone, because there's so little accountability, there's supposed to be state-by-state in-person inspections. That's just not happening. So some legislation we were working on with Congressman Hank Johnson from Georgia would not only prohibit the transfer of the heavy weapons that I've already mentioned, but it would also mandate in-person annual accountability and inspection of equipment that we feel okay coming from the war zone, whether it's, you know, a microwave or some office equipment. It makes sense to recycle that, and let's do in-state, in-person inspections of that and do some accountability. But first check and see if the police force even needs it. A small town in Georgia without a body of water nearby acquired some boats and scuba gear. So you're seeing towns get equipment that they don't even need. And so any kind of oversight or monitoring would be a small but important step in the right direction.
Michael Shank, one of the things that you've also brought to my attention is not only the militarization of police, but similarly the security personnel on college campuses. Can you tell us more about that?
Right. So Ohio State University, I grew up in Ohio, so I didn't go to OSU, but Ohio State University has acquired an MRAP. And what it says to the population, whether they're in Roanoke Rapids, North Carolina, or Columbia's department in South Carolina, as you've already mentioned, or Ohio State University's students, is it says, you're the enemy, you need to be controlled, and so it puts the population in a defensive position immediately. And so you're going to see it's a cyclical effect, and they're creating the very reality that ultimately we don't want in America by the mere presence of militarized gear. It creates an us versus them, and it creates a defensive posture on behalf of the population.
I wonder if you can go back for a moment and the whole nature of this surplus, if you will. What does this say about the industry? And I had started by saying that the militarization of our foreign policy really has led to the ramping up of the militarization of our policing apparatus. If you could kind of connect the benefit to the armaments industry and that whole question of the militarization of the way we look at conflict internationally and then import it to our home base.
That's a great question, because increasingly we see, quote, enemy, unquote, as someone that we need, and I'm saying we, I mean the U.S. government, as someone we need to kill, that there's a finite number of enemies, and if we just kill that finite number of enemies, the adversary will be defeated. This is relatively new for the U.S. government to refuse to have a conversation with the adversary, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah or anyone in Iraq or Afghanistan. If you look at our predecessors, presidential predecessors, whether it's Nixon or Kennedy, they were still willing to have a conversation with Russia or China, which was very important in terms of de-escalation. Now, on our foreign policy front, our first go-to is military. We think we can kill a finite number of enemies rather than doing any kind of de-escalation, whether it's reintegration, disarmament, any of the kind of the DDR stuff, disarmament, demobilization, reintegration of former fighters, or making sure they have alternative livelihoods so that they don't choose violence. We're not pursuing any of that, so too on our domestic front. But the defense industry interests, if you've also intimated and alluded to, certainly pales in comparison to the F-35 program, the Joint Strike Fighter, because that's a $400 billion program. So defense industry is on top of that. And you've seen, anytime you pick up a Hill paper, whether it's the Hill, Roll Call, or Political, you see full-page ads from the defense industry vis-a-vis the F-35 program. But for DHS terrorism grants, $34 billion, that's of interest to the defense industry, and they are on the Hill constantly lobbying, and it ranges between $130 million a year to $150, $160 million a year in terms of what they're lobbying with campaign contributions, donations to campaigns, then just money spent making sure that they're on the Hill in each office. So yeah, if you think about a story from Tupelo, Mississippi, where they acquired a helicopter through the 1033 program, it immediately needed $100,000 worth of upgrades and then an annual repair cost of $20,000. So that's going to behoove the defense industry to get involved in lobbying for the 1033 program. I've even heard of defense industry helping local lawmakers and local policymakers fill out the right application forms for the 1033 program and Department of Homeland Security's terrorism grants program. It's pretty simple. For the 1033, it's just a page essentially that you fill out, and then you go online and you do an inventory check and you see what equipment's for free, and then you ask for it. But the form is pretty simple, but I've even heard stories from reporters of defense industry helping local lawmakers fill out those forms. So there's clear financial interest in these programs on behalf of the defense industry. It may pale in comparison to the F-35, but it's still an important profit motive for the defense industry.
Michael Shank, take us from your personal experience during the protests, what became known as the battle in Seattle, through this moment where yourself and, of course, Congressman Hank Johnson of Georgia has a bill that seeks to essentially respond to the 1033 program.
Sure. So I was in Seattle working for an environmental nonprofit during the WTO protests, so I joined in those nonviolent protests and was tear gassed and shot at with rubber bullets and rubber canisters. The Seattle police chief at the time, Norm Stamper, was responsible for a lot of those harsh tactics, which we've also seen in Ferguson. Interestingly, a quick note on Norm Stamper, he's now had an about face, and we actually had him on the House side here in D.C. in Congress appear at a briefing that Hank Johnson sponsored, because he has disavowed all commitment to those kind of harsh tactics. He's a big believer in community-oriented policing, but not a believer in this militarization of police force. So he's kind of recused himself of any involvement on that front and apologized for his tactics and thinks they were in error. Later, I was working for Congressman Mike Honda out of California, and I was looking at pictures on the Oakland Tribune site of armored personnel carriers responding to Occupy protesters, and found the photos deeply disturbing. And I think that's what's been so compelling for media or members of Congress who are newly weighing in on this issue. When they look at pictures of these MRAPs, or armored personnel carriers, it is frightening. It's frightening whether it's taking place in Afghanistan, Iraq, or in our main streets. It's just that so many people in America think that war zone shouldn't trickle back here. My colleagues here at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, we have a problem with the wars overseas and the wars here, just to be clear. But the pictures were so disturbing for people and myself. And so last fall, my colleague Elizabeth Beavers and I started writing for The Guardian and Reuters on this issue. It got some good attention, and then we approached Hank Johnson early this year. So in March already, Hank and I were writing for USA Today. That got some more attention. We drafted the legislation, and it looks like we'll introduce it now in September. Hank Johnson will introduce the legislation in September with what looks like bipartisan support.
What a great note to really wrap up with. What do we do to support the legislation? What is the specific number of the bill so we can make sure that we begin the process of stopping the militarization of Main Street, get the military off of Main Street? Michael?
Mimi, thank you for asking that question. Anyone listening I would love for them to call up their House of Representatives and the Senate from New York and anyone listening across the country. Senator McCaskill is having a hearing in Homeland Security Committee this September, so it looks like we'll have bipartisan support in the Senate as well. Those bills don't have numbers as of yet. Once it's introduced, it will have a bill number, but all they have to do, anyone listening, call up your member of Congress in the House and the Senate and say, we want this 1033 program banned in terms of this military equipment, tanks, Humvees, MRAPs, assault weapons, drones, grenade launchers, prohibited from coming to our main streets. The member of Congress should know what that is now post-Ferguson, but they can reach out to Friends Committee on National Legislation. We can help them with any of that advocacy. If they go to our website, we've got some information on this, fcnl.org, but expect bipartisan legislation in the Senate as well.
We're going to have you back when the bill passes.
Great.
It will be a major, major import for people to the maintenance of any form of democratic right and right of assembly and protest. We want to make sure we get the military off of Main Street. Michael Shank, thank you for the work that you've done. Thank you for working on this legislation. And everybody, get on the horn and make sure you call your legislator to tell them about the bill and that you want to get the military off of Main Street. Michael Shank is the Associate Director for Legislative Affairs at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, and thank you for your work, and it's great speaking with you.
Thank you, Mimi.